Girls We Know, written by Emily Cox, read by Anna Woods and Lloyd King.
Elizabeth felt the cold bathroom tiles pressed against her face, and the smell of bleach attacked her nose savagely. Sitting up, she pushed her hair from her face and exhaled deeply. Everything felt 10 times closer, and the room was getting smaller every second that passed. Elizabeth pushed herself up, examined the train wreck that was her face. Makeup smudged, eyes sunken, and ripped clothing? This was a new addition. She panicked, throwing herself around the room desperately to find any evidence of someone else vacating her space. Nothing. Spinning around, she decided she was jumping to conclusions, and set about showering and starting her day as usual. It was just another drunken night that Fran had controlled, just another drunken night she had no memory of. As she went to take hold of the shower curtain, she jumped. Her hands were a rich, deep red. A shiny coating of blood smothered her hands. Shaking, she brought her hands up to her face, trying in vain to wipe the smudges from her hands. She scrubbed until her palms were raw and bloody, but to no avail. Sobbing now, she planned to wash away the night, stripping down to her underwear and turning on the water to a body-burning temperature. A rev sounded outside the window. She turned, startled by the overbearing noise. Carla, her stepmother, a cruel, undeserving woman, was staring up, her dark eyes boring into Elizabeth's skull. The two women looked for information from each other, Elizabeth finding panic and Carla discovering worry. Elizabeth began to shake, falling to the ground, submerging herself in confusion. Her mind was no longer hers. She felt herself handing over her body to someone else, someone stronger and more determined. She drifted into an intense dream, no longer able to control her movements or thoughts. The lights went out and her entire body slumped onto the floor. It was then she awoke, more powerful and forthcoming. She knew why her clothes were ripped, why her eyes were sunken, and most importantly, why her hands were covered in blood and why her stepmother was escaping. Fran jumped up, filled with rage and defiance. "You bitch!" she screamed, putting on her clothes and hurtling down the stairs. She was just in time to watch Carla pull off the drive and into the distance. Panicked and grief-stricken, she pulled the helmet from its stand, sprinting to the garage and mounting a beautifully modified motorbike. The crimson paintwork glistened in the midday sun, racing stripes and shimmer allowing the light to glint off it as Fran breathlessly kick-started the roaring roadhog. Making up the gap between them in a matter of minutes, Fran dodged between trees and logs on the off-road terrain, desperately trying to run Carla into a ditch. A siren sounded, muffled in the distance. Her heart pounding from her chest, Fran sped up, watching Carla's jet black hair thrashing about in the wind. Just a few more inches and she'd be tie to tie with her. Fran momentarily felt herself flying towards her, arms outstretched to drag her from the half-hearted attempt at a motorbike. The sirens were closing in on her as she edged closer to Carla's wheels. She looked back for a split second to catch a blue light manoeuvring between the trees. It was at that moment she felt her bike stop and the wind attacking her face as she flew through the air with ease. "Fuck," she mouthed as she felt her face hit the floor and everything fell silent. The pain was like nothing she had ever felt before. The burning in her face, the searing pain creeping up her leg. She felt like death. The worst part about not knowing what had happened was the ultimate fear that she had done something wrong. Elizabeth looked up, dazed, but still able to breathe in the warm smoke and the smell of cinders. She coughed and spluttered as the heavy breathing began again. She thought about the possibilities of the situation and began to feel faint. Fire, excruciating pain. Was she in hell? Easing herself up on her arms, she surveyed her surroundings. A wooden chair sat in the corner, and a set of tables were joined as if she was sitting at the head of it all. She then looked down to discover a note attached to her helmet. Squinting through poor eyesight and smoke, she began reading.
To whomever you are, we found you tangled in some branches on the northern side of the forest. To save you from being eaten by angry animals, arrested for dangerous driving, or dying from hypothermia, we brought you back to our home. There is food in the cupboards and plenty of board games in the drawers. When you are well enough, ring the bell. Jason. P.S. Don't worry about the burning smell. We haven't quite managed to control our central heating.
Elizabeth smiled at the warm-hearted gesture and stretched out her arm to ring the bell. "Don't do it." A voice in the back of her head startled her and she withdrew her hand quickly. "Why not?" She spoke out loud, a quiver in her voice. "They could be anyone. Paedophiles, murderers, you don't know. Get the hell out of there." Elizabeth was confused. Her personalities had never collided before. She struggled to push Fran to the back of her head, quarrelling with her mind until she thought she had rid herself of the violent woman. She rung the bell hurriedly, and the door burst open. Faces of eagerness and intrigue followed. She surveyed each one. The first looked stupendously upbeat. He beamed down the table, a shimmering watch on his wrist and all the dapperness of a businessman. His slicked back hair glimmered in the candlelight, and with a pop of his collar, he was gone. The next followed him in, dressed to the same stature, yet sporting a worried, almost timid look on his face. He shuffled in, nodding in Elizabeth's direction, and she smiled back courteously. 3 more bounded in, quarrelling about a previous bet the brilliant blonde man seemingly won. They all wore garish green suits, mismatching ties to complement them, bowing towards the girl who couldn't help but snigger. A robust, well-built man was the 6th to stagger through the door. A can of, Elizabeth squinted, home brew, sat in his hand comfortably, as if it were moulded to fit it perfectly. He winked and stumbled to the side, collapsing onto a stool, using all his strength not to tumble straight off the back. The 7th and final man looked angry and worn. A frown sat lopsided on his dark face, and his sunken features complemented the worn grey suit he wore perfectly. This man intrigued Elizabeth. Their eyes met, and he began to speak in a voice that surprised the girl.
Welcome to our home.
Taking a deep drag on his cigarette, he continued.
I'll introduce you to the men of the house. This is Darren. He's our mechanic and general handyman.
The cocky-looking man in the beautifully pressed suit waved and lit his own cigarette, encasing the room in smoke. A mechanic? You have got to be kidding me.
Next, James. Brewer of all things delicious and head chef in the kitchen.
The man looked up and squeaked hello before shooting his head back down to the floor.
The lime green trio over there are Edward, Stuart and Dave. They're our painter decorators.
Pleased to meet you, they all chortled, clinking their tankards of beer together and grinning like Cheshire cats.
And that's Craig, our resident drunkard and computer wizard. He does the accounts and makes sure we don't run out of beer for the coming weeks.
Ace Laird, all right, came from the man, followed by a hiccup and a snort. This was all too much to take in. The suited men were mechanics, and the tubby drunkard's an accountant? What a different world this is.
And I,
the man spoke politely,
I'm Jason. I run this joint.
All the men cheered as their main man introduced himself and set about dishing out the food for everyone. Elizabeth then cleared her throat and spoke for the first time. It's lovely to meet you all, she squeaked, but what is it you do? The man named Jason smiled and offered out his hand.
Come with me, child. We'll show you.
Nodding at the surrounding men, they all rose from the table, tankards in hand, and headed for the outdoors. Elizabeth took his hand, but as she did so, the voice came back. They're murderers! If they murder us, I'm blaming you! She shook it off and continued with the men, all burly and overwhelming in comparison to her 5'5" stature. They got to a shed on the opposite side of the building and left the girl to wait and worry and brood over what could be going on. A drug company? Bank robbers? Murderers? She needn't have worried. The doors flew open and out they all came, revving up motorbike after motorbike as they sped out of the rundown shack.
We're bikers, just like you.
She almost slipped up, saying she couldn't drive, she had never learned and was too scared to, but refrained. They didn't need to know. Oh, but they will. The voice appeared again. She hated Fran, the drunken foul-mouthed bitch at the back of her head. As the bikes came to a halt, she brought herself back to the real world, trying desperately to push Fran away. I'm not going anywhere now, get the fuck out my way. Her head began to hurt and she fell to the floor, not strong enough to stop the vixen taking control of her mind. The group of men who were protecting her came rushing over, throwing their helmets to the floor. Elizabeth fell into a daze, lost and alone, thrust into the back of her own mind. Fran shook her head and yawned. Not opening her eyes yet, she knew the men would be surrounding her and she was ready to take them all on. Hey, you alright there? Hey! She heard the men shouting in different muffled voices, and she inwardly smirked to herself. I'm fine, she thought, but you're not. Balling up her fists, she cracked open her eyes, lying still and surveying the many faces looming over her. At that moment, she let out a high-pitched scream and sunk her teeth into the nearest fleshiest piece of skin she could find. With blood in her mouth and the metallic taste hitting her tongue, she grinned. Fuck you, she snarled. Fuck you all.